For nearly a quarter century, a single sentence, just 6 words, has shaped more military decisions than most of the lawmakers who voted for it ever imagined. It's the authorization for use of military force, passed just days after 9/11. And over time, it's been used to justify lethal force in places like Somalia and Syria, and even invoked to defend surveillance programs. 4 presidents, 2 wars, countless operations across borders most Americans have never seen. And through it all, that sentence has never been amended, never repealed, despite recurring hearings and multiple efforts to replace it. Now, in 2025, Congress is finally moving to repeal the 2002 Iraq AUMF, the one that authorized war against Saddam Hussein's regime. But the far more powerful law from 2001, that one remains untouched. And that tells us something, not just about law, but about habit. Because the more a republic forgets who decides when war begins, the harder it becomes to remember why that power was placed there to begin with. So today we're going to look at how we got here, and what the Constitution really says about who starts a war. You see, the framers of the Constitution were clear about this division. Article 1 gives Congress the power to declare war, and raise armies, and make rules for the military. Article 2 makes the President Commander-in-Chief, responsible for conducting military operations, not starting them. And that wasn't a technicality. It was a warning. James Madison once wrote that the executive is the branch of power most interested in war, and the most prone to it. So, he said, the Constitution, with studied care, gave the war power to the legislature. Alexander Hamilton in Federalist number 69 spelled out the contrast. The British monarch could declare war and raise fleets and decide when to fight, but the American president, he could command those forces. Congress had already authorized, but that's it. So the founders gave us a balance. Over and over again. Congress makes war, the president wages it. But over the past century, and especially the last 25 years, that balance has quietly shifted. Just 1 week after 9/11, Congress passed the 2001 AUMF. The key sentence, those 60 words, gave the president the power to use force against those who planned, authorized, committed, or aided the attacks, or those who harbored them. It didn't name countries, it didn't name groups, it didn't include the phrase associated forces. That concept, the idea that you can target new groups that are somehow aligned with the original ones, that came later, through executive interpretation. And then in 2002, Congress passed another AUMF. This one authorized force against Iraq, citing Saddam Hussein's regime and weapons of mass destruction. Thank you, Colin Powell. But even after that regime fell, the authorization stayed on the books. Years later, it was used to justify the strike that killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, even though Iran had nothing to do with the Iraq invasion, and Soleimani had not been authorized by name in either AUMF. So by 2016, the 2001 AUMF had been used in at least 14 countries. By 2021, that number had likely exceeded 20. The operations it authorized ranged from drone strikes and counterterrorism raids to detentions and joint missions with foreign forces. The words stayed the same, but the meaning stretched, and Congress just let it happen. Quick note here, if you're finding value in this series, I invite you to visit dancoyle.com, where you'll find essays, videos, and other gifts that I've been building around history and power and civic life. You can also support this work there if you want. Every contribution certainly helps keep these stories freely offered. All right, let's keep going. The habit of delegation didn't start in 2001. In 1964, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave President Johnson broad authority to escalate U.S. involvement in Vietnam. That resolution stayed in place until 1971, long after the public had turned against the war. And in 1999, during the Kosovo conflict, President Clinton launched an air campaign without new congressional authorization. The Justice Department later argued that, taken together with prior statutes and funding measures, Congress had implicitly authorized continued hostilities, even though the War Powers Resolution's 60-day clock had expired. In 2011, the Obama administration bombed targets in Libya and then claimed the operation didn't count as hostilities under the War Powers Resolution, so no new authorization was needed. Isn't that cute? In 2019, Congress passed a War Powers Resolution to end U.S. support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen. For the first time, both chambers agreed, but the president vetoed it, and Congress didn't have the votes to override. Each of these moments chipped away at the original design, not by rewriting the Constitution, but by working around it. So why does this keep happening? Why do war authorizations meant to address specific threats stay active for decades? Well, part of it is risk. Once troops are deployed, repealing an authorization feels like pulling the legal rug out from under them. Presidents warn of operational gaps, and lawmakers worry about political blame if something goes wrong. There's also drift. Over time, executive lawyers reinterpret authorizations. Associated forces become a catch-all. Theaters of war expand, and oversight narrows. In 2002, the Iraq AUMF was once about Saddam Hussein, and later it was reframed to justify actions for a stable Iraq. It's very different. And that included strikes against non-Iraqi targets. And other legal authorities step in too. Under Title 10 and special authorities like 127E and Section 1202, the military can support proxy forces and irregular warfare missions with limited public visibility and constrained but real oversight. These tools blur the line between war and security assistance. So even when Congress tries to write new AUMFs, efforts collapse over how long they should last, what groups they name, and whether limits should apply to detention or ground troops. And while all that debate happens, the old laws just stay. Another quick note, if you're the kind of person who wants more history, more context, more civic depth in your feed, check out my Patreon at patreon.com/walkaboutswithdan. You'll find full-length episodes and a weekly audio series similar to the stories I tell here, but more frequently and sometimes in more depth. So thanks for being a part of this. So there's a deeper cost to all of this. Every time Congress backs away from its constitutional role, the public loses its connection to the decision. War becomes a background hum. The authorizations fade into memory, and legal reasoning gets buried in footnotes. And over time, our consent becomes implied rather than expressed. As of October 2025, both the House and Senate have voted, through their respective versions of the National Defense Authorization Act, to repeal the 1991 and 2002 Iraq AUMFs. Final repeal is awaiting conference agreement. And that's a meaningful step. But the 2001 AUMF, the one that opened the door to all of this, is still standing. So, what would it take to reclaim the balance the Constitution intended? It could start with guardrails, time limits so authorizations don't live forever, named enemy lists so we know who we're fighting, geographic boundaries so Congress can see the scope, and repeal clauses so no outdated law stays by accident. None of these ideas are radical, I don't think. They're just tools to remind us who the war power belongs to. In 1795, James Madison wrote that of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded. Not just because of the violence, but because war consolidates power in the hands of very few. He called war the true nurse of executive aggrandizement. And here in 2025, we're still living with the habits of a Congress that found it easier to authorize than to oversee. Easier to fund than repeal. Easier to look away than to hold the burden. The Constitution gave Congress the responsibility to decide when a war begins. What would it take for your representative and for ours to carry that burden again? What would it take for us to ask them to?